She thought it was a charity dinner, until the CEO whispered, "This is actually our blind date." The chandeliers sparkled like stars caught in a ballroom ceiling. Strings of soft jazz hummed in the background as waiters in black and white moved gracefully between tables set in rich linen and glass. The annual Thorn Foundation charity dinner was in full swing, with laughter rising in elegant waves from clusters of well-dressed guests. Ilara Westfield took a careful breath before stepping into the grand hall. She smoothed the front of her navy blue dress, a simple, elegant piece with capped sleeves, and pushed back a loose curl from her face. Her blonde hair, naturally soft and wavy, had been twisted into a low bun, but a few strands refused to stay in place. She was not used to events like these. Her world was more often filled with sticky fingers, children's laughter, and crayon-smeared desks. But her boss had insisted. "It's a networking opportunity," she had said, "and you deserve to be seen." When a staff member checked her name on the guest list, they smiled and gestured. "You're at table 12, Miss Westfield. Right this way." She followed, clutching her small clutch tighter than necessary, until the staffer stopped at a table near the center of the room. Only one person sat there, a man, tall, well-groomed, in a sharply tailored black suit. He rose as she approached. "Ilara Westfield?" he asked, voice deep and calm. She blinked, surprised. "Yes." He extended his hand politely and then pulled out a chair for her. Grant Thorn. The name hit her with mild disbelief. Thorn, as in Thorn Foundation? As in CEO of Thorn Technologies? That Grant Thorn? I think I may be at the wrong table," she said softly, glancing around for a staff member. "You are exactly where you're meant to be," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. She sat down, a bit stiffly, unsure. The waiter poured red wine into their glasses and left them with a nod. Ilara looked at the place cards. Yes, it was her name, neatly printed next to his. Before she could say anything else, Grant leaned in slightly, his tone low but clear. "This isn't just a charity dinner," he said. "This is our blind date." Her eyes widened. What?" He looked a little amused, but mostly sincere. "My friend Madison and your boss conspired behind our backs. Apparently, we've both been working too hard and avoiding real connections." Their words, not mine. Ilara's heart raced. She suddenly felt very aware of how formal this night had felt just minutes ago, and how completely unexpected it had become. She gave a nervous laugh, her hands resting awkwardly on the white tablecloth. "So, I am not here to pitch early education grants to your foundation?" Grant shook his head slowly. "No pitches tonight, just dinner, and, if you're willing, a real conversation." It took her a long moment to recover from the surprise. But something in his voice, not commanding, not smug, just quiet and steady, allowed her to breathe a little easier. She glanced down at her wine glass, then back at him. "Well, I guess if I am already here." He gave her that almost smile again. "I am glad you are." The initial tension softened as the first course was served. Ilara found herself settling in, her fingers loosening from the edge of her napkin. Grant did not ask generic questions. He asked about her work, her favorite childhood books, and what made her decide to work with children. And even though her heartbeat still fluttered with the remnants of confusion, Ilara realized she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in weeks. Maybe it was not the dinner she expected. But perhaps that was not such a bad thing. The clinking of silverware and soft hum of jazz music blended into the warm glow of candlelight. Though the hall still buzzed with elegant conversations and polished laughter, Ilara felt strangely removed from it all, tucked inside a smaller, quieter moment. Across the table, Grant Thorn had not once checked his phone. He had not bragged about his company or quoted statistics. Instead, he listened, truly listened, with the quiet attentiveness of someone who did not take human stories lightly. Elara found herself relaxing as she spoke, though her guard had been high at the start. She told him about her work at the child support center, the paint-streaked afternoons, and how little things, like helping a 4-year-old pronounce the word turtle, could feel like entire victories. When she laughed softly, recounting how one boy stuck googly eyes on a goldfish drawing and insisted it was a dragon, Grant smiled. Not the kind of performative grin she had seen on corporate donors, but something smaller, genuine, almost shy. "What made you choose that line of work?" he asked, swirling the wine in his glass but barely touching it. "I grew up in a children's home," she said. "It was not fancy, but warm. There was a teacher who practically raised me, Miss Clara. She taught me how to draw, how to spell my name, how to believe I mattered. I guess I wanted to be someone's Clara too." Grant did not respond right away, but his eyes changed. Something softened, settled, and Elara felt it even from across the table. He leaned forward slightly. "Do you remember every child you have worked with?" She shook her head with a small smile. "No. Some stay a week, some for years. But there was one girl, very quiet, barely spoke. She had this deep, still sadness in her eyes. Always sat alone during playtime. I remember teaching her to draw lavender flowers. I do not even know why that stuck with me." Grant's hand, steady on his glass, suddenly stilled. He looked down, then slowly set his fork aside. "That little girl," he said quietly, voice wrapped in gravity, "is my daughter, Sophie." Elara froze. The world blurred for a second as her memories rushed back. She remembered the pale pink dress, the way Sophie had stared at the paper before finally pressing a purple crayon to it. She remembered her barely, their smile the day someone came to pick her up, a man Elara had assumed was with the foundation. "You're Sophie's father?" she whispered. Grant nodded once, slowly. "I thought the center only took in children without families," she said, confusion laced with guilt. He exhaled, glancing sideways, away from the table. "After my wife died, I unraveled. I could not function, let alone care for a grieving toddler. I made a decision most fathers would not admit. They say you're supposed to always show up. But I was a shell, so I placed Sophie somewhere I trusted, a center our family's foundation supports. I knew the staff were kind, that she would be safe." Elara's eyes blurred with the weight of understanding. "I thought I failed her," he continued, "until one day, months later, she showed me a picture she drew. A rainbow. She said an angel lady taught her how." She smiled when she said it. Elara pressed her lips together, overwhelmed. "I did not know she remembered me," she said. Grant looked up, meeting her gaze. She remembered everything. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was reverent. Elara looked at him, not as a CEO, not as the powerful man everyone whispered about, but as a father who had lost more than most, and still carried it with quiet grace. Something in her chest stirred, a thread pulling gently, unexpectedly. She had never believed in fate. But maybe fate was not loud. Maybe it whispered at a dinner table, beneath candlelight, between two people connected by a lavender drawing and a little girl's memory. She smiled, slow, soft, unguarded. And for the first time in years, so did he. It was late Saturday morning when Elara's phone buzzed with a message from Grant. "Sophie keeps talking about the lady with paper stars. She wants to thank you properly. Are you free this afternoon?" Elara read it twice, a small smile forming despite herself. She hesitated for a moment, then typed back, "Sure. Where?" The Riverside Family Park was already dotted with kites, picnic blankets, and toddlers chasing bubbles when Elara arrived. The sun peeked between soft clouds, and the breeze carried the scent of cotton candy and fresh grass. She barely had time to scan the crowd before something small and pink crashed into her legs from behind. "Elara," a little voice squealed. Startled, she turned to find a tiny girl in a polka-dot pink dress looking up at her with shining eyes and a smile too wide for her face. "Are you the angel lady that gave me stars on paper?" Elara's heart flipped. "Yes," she whispered, dropping to her knees. "You remember that?" Sophie nodded fiercely. "I kept the stars. I drew a rainbow next to them. Daddy put it on the fridge." Elara laughed, wrapping the girl in a warm hug. She felt a lump in her throat she had not expected. "Thank you for remembering me, sweetheart." Grant stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, watching with quiet fondness. He gave her a small nod as she looked up, and she returned it, heart oddly full. The three of them found a shaded spot under a large oak tree. Sophie pulled crayons from her tiny backpack and insisted Elara teach her to fold stars again. As they bent and creased the paper, Sophie chattered about school, her pet turtle named Marshmallow, and how she hated green peas. Grant sat nearby on the picnic blanket, reading a book but glancing over every few minutes, his gaze softening each time Elara laughed. As the afternoon wore on, they strolled together along the edge of the lake, Sophie skipping ahead, chasing dragonflies. Elara was mid-sentence when her heel caught on a gnarled tree root. She pitched forward with a startled gasp. In a blink, Grant was there. His hand closed around her wrist firmly. He pulled her back just before she stumbled into the damp soil. Instead, she fell against his chest, his other arm circling around her waist instinctively. They froze. Elara could hear the thunder of her own heartbeat as she looked up at him, inches from his face. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his breath warm, his eyes searching hers. She nodded slowly, cheeks flushed. "Yes, just clumsy." He helped her stand upright again but did not step away immediately. For a second longer, they stood there, the late afternoon light catching in the gold of her hair, the air heavy with something unspoken. Then Sophie's voice rang out in the distance. "Look what I made." They turned to see the little girl proudly holding up a crayon drawing. Later, as they sat back under the oak tree, Elara examined the drawing closely. 3 stick figures stood holding hands. A small girl with a bright pink dress, a tall man with spiky brown hair, and a woman with long yellow curls. Beneath them, in bold pink crayon, were the words, "My family." Elara's breath caught. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held the paper. Sophie had drawn her into the picture, into her vision of what a family could be. She looked at Grant. He did not smile, but his eyes met hers and held them, steady, deep, vulnerable. In that look, she read so much: gratitude, memory, and maybe. A question he was not yet ready to ask aloud. She turned back to Sophie, who beamed as if the world had no doubts, no conditions, only belief. Elara folded the picture carefully and placed it into her bag like something sacred. And for the first time in years, the word family did not feel like a distant dream. It felt like a soft beginning. After that afternoon in the park, Elara found herself returning to Grant's house more often. At first, she told herself it was for Sophie, because the little girl's smile was too bright to say no to. But with each visit, she realized something else. She liked the quiet warmth of the Thorne home, the way the sun poured through the kitchen windows in the late afternoon, the way Sophie's laughter echoed through the halls, and the way Grant, reserved, calm, deliberate, seemed to look at her like she brought something into their world that had long been missing. There were no grand declarations, no talk of dating, no labels, just small, unspoken things. Elara began helping Sophie with her preschool activities, coloring animals, gluing paper shapes, reading picture books that Elara used to read to herself as a child. She taught Sophie how to fold paper cranes, and they made an entire mobile of stars and ducks that now hung over the little girl's bed. Grant, for his part, quietly adapted to their new routine. He began preparing dinner each time Alara came. Simple meals like spaghetti with garlic bread, chicken noodle soup, blueberry muffins. Sophie helped stir. He never said much, but he was always present. One evening, Alara sat at the dining table, surrounded by sheets of colored paper. She was showing Sophie how to make a paper fox when she noticed Grant standing by the doorway, watching. A moment later, he walked over and sat beside her, rolling up his sleeves. "All right," he said. "Teach me." Alara blinked. "You? Want to fold paper animals?" He nodded, a little sheepish. "I never imagined a CEO learning to fold paper ducks," she teased. He smirked. "I never imagined wanting to." His first duck looked more like a confused turtle, but Sophie clapped anyway. Later that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Alara stayed behind for tea. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that made truth easier to speak. "I was engaged once," she said softly, wrapping her hands around her cup, "to a man who worked in finance. We met at a charity gala too, actually." Grant looked over but didn't interrupt. "He said I was too soft, too full of dreams. He wanted a partner, not a preschool teacher with crayons in her bag." There was a pause. Then Grant stood and walked to a drawer in the hallway cabinet. He returned with a wooden box and placed it on the table. Inside was a set of beautifully crafted colored pencils, the kind artists used, the kind that weren't cheap. He looked her in the eye. "Then he was blind," he said. "These are the tools of someone who builds people, not walls." Alara smiled, but tears welled up in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, something shifted. Not loudly, not with fireworks, but with quiet understanding. A week later, after another simple dinner, Alara stood by the door, getting ready to leave. She had promised herself not to stay too late, to not blur lines she hadn't even drawn yet. But before she could reach for her coat, tiny footsteps padded down the hallway. Sophie appeared in her pajamas, eyes wide and worried. "Do not go," she whispered, clinging to Alara's hand. "If you leave, Daddy gets quiet again." Alara froze. She looked down at the little girl and saw more than worry. She saw fear. Fear of losing someone again. Her heart clenched. From behind them, Grant had come into view. He stopped, his expression unreadable. But his eyes held so much. Alara bent down, brushing Sophie's hair back gently. "I am not going far, sweetheart," she said softly. "I just need some time, okay?" Sophie nodded slowly, though her eyes brimmed with tears. Alara stood, gave Grant a small, quiet look, and left. She did not know what this was, what it could become, but as she stepped out into the night, one thing was clear. She had not just become part of their lives, they had become part of hers. And walking away, even for a moment, hurt more than she had expected. The rain came down in thick sheets, drumming steadily on the canopy overhead, as Alara and Grant stood side by side beneath the awning of the old brick building. The charity event had ended earlier than expected due to the storm, and most guests had already scattered to their cars. But neither of them moved. Alara folded her arms, her jacket barely holding off the chill. The hem of her dress was damp, and her hair curled softly from the moisture. Grant stood quietly beside her, hands in the pockets of his coat, eyes focused on the rain. For a while, they just listened. The air between them felt thick, not just with water, but with something unspoken. Regret, maybe, or the weight of things they both carried but had never said aloud. The city, usually loud even in the rain, had gone quiet. It felt like they were the only two people in the world. Then, as if the storm had broken something inside him, Grant spoke. "She was supposed to be gone for 10 days, he said quietly. "Kenya. She was working on a literacy project with a non-profit she loved." Alara looked up at him, surprised by the sudden vulnerability in his voice. "She begged me to come with her," he continued, his gaze still fixed on the dark sky. But I had meetings, investor deadlines. I told her I'd donate, that I'd fund the whole trip, but I couldn't take the time. His jaw tightened. The car she was in rolled over on a wet road. No seat belts. No one made it out. Alara's breath caught. I didn't even get to say goodbye, he said, barely above a whisper. I paid for the trip, wrote the check myself. And that's what haunts me most. She stepped closer but said nothing. I thought writing that check made me useful, he added bitterly, but it just bought me a front row seat to the worst moment of my life. He finally turned to her, eyes hollow but steady. Rain misted the edges of his hair and coat, making him look more human, less untouchable. For a long time, he said, I believed love just destroyed everything it touched. That if I let anyone get close again, they'd disappear too. He exhaled slowly, almost like it hurt. But then I saw you, he continued, voice shaking just slightly. In that park dancing with Sophie, singing off-key, letting her paint stars on your shoes like it was the most natural thing in the world. He looked down at her, eyes raw and honest. I never believed in healing, he whispered, until I saw you dance with my daughter. The words hung in the rain like a confession too long buried. Alara blinked, tears mixing with the mist on her cheeks. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached out, slowly, and took his hand. It was cold, larger than hers, but trembling just slightly as their fingers laced together. And then they stood like that, under the rain, under the weight of grief and guilt, of memory and hope. She did not promise him it would be okay. He did not ask her to stay. But in the silence, a bridge was built. One made not of grand gestures, but of quiet understanding, of pain shared and not judged, of something broken, beginning to mend. Because sometimes healing does not roar in. It arrives as a whisper, offered in the middle of a storm, with nothing but a hand to hold and a heart brave enough to receive it. It had been weeks since Alara found herself slipping easily into the rhythm of Grant's world, late-night dinners filled with laughter, story time with Sophie curled in her lap, quiet glances that said more than words ever could. She wasn't just a guest in their home anymore. She had started to feel like she belonged. But one Thursday afternoon, everything shifted. Alara had stopped by Grant's office unannounced, carrying a handmade scrapbook Sophie had worked on for Daddy's big desk. She smiled as she passed through the sleek glass doors of Thorne Innovations, waving at the receptionist, who now knew her by name. She was halfway to Grant's office when she saw the woman. Elegant, sharp-eyed, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, Camille. Alara recognized her from a photo she had once seen on the bookshelf in Grant's study. Camille, she recalled, was his late wife's closest friend, godmother to Sophie, and one of the few people from the past who still visited occasionally. Alara paused at the hallway's corner, watching as Camille leaned over Grant's desk, her voice low and precise. Alara couldn't hear the words, but she could see the tight line of Grant's jaw, the way his hands were clasped too tightly in front of him. Camille turned slightly, her eyes locked with Alara's. An hour later, Alara found herself sitting in the break lounge, sipping lukewarm coffee Camille had politely offered. It felt more like an interview than a conversation. I suppose this isn't quite what we all expected, Camille began smoothly. Sophie does seem fond of you. Children, after all, don't know the complexities of grief or replacement. Alara blinked. Excuse me? Camille smiled, almost kindly. You seem kind, but kind isn't always enough. Grant's world is layered. He has a legacy to protect, a daughter to raise in memory of her mother. I'm not trying to replace anyone, Alara replied, her voice firm. Camille nodded slowly. Good, because no one can. Later that night, as Alara waited for Grant to return from a late board meeting, she wandered into his home office. The lights were dim, the soft hum of the city pulsing just outside the windows. She placed Sophie's scrapbook gently on his desk, but as she moved to leave, her eyes landed on something tucked into the bottom drawer left slightly ajar. It was an old photo frame. A candid shot. Grant, his late wife Lily, and a toddler-aged Sophie. Lily was laughing, arms around both of them. Written in gold ink on the frame's edge, "My forever girls." Elara stared at the photo, breath caught in her throat. She wasn't angry. She wasn't jealous. She just suddenly felt like a shadow cast over a painting too beautiful to disturb. Everything Camille said echoed louder now. What if she was a replacement? What if her presence was comforting not because it was real, but because it filled a space left empty? Tears threatened, but she didn't let them fall. Not yet. Instead, she walked back to the guest room, packed her things slowly, folding each blouse with the tenderness of someone leaving more than a place. By the time Grant returned home that night, the apartment was quiet. Sophie was asleep. The only sign of Elara was a note left on his desk, sitting next to the scrapbook she had brought. It read, "I saw the photo. She was beautiful. You loved her deeply. I would never try to erase that. But I cannot be the chapter that overwrites hers. E." When Grant found it, he didn't move for a long time. He just stood there, one hand gripping the edge of the desk, the other clutching a crayon Sophie had used in her book. And outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, then steadily harder, almost like grief coming back to visit. But this time, with the echo of someone who left without slamming the door. Someone who loved gently and walked away quietly. For now, the hills were quieter out here. At the little countryside center where Elara now worked, everything moved slower. Children played barefoot under wide skies, and no one asked questions about her past, only if she wanted tea or if she liked peach cobbler. But silence could not stop a memory from echoing, especially when the mail arrived one afternoon. A small envelope, pink, slightly wrinkled, with uneven crayon letters. To Angel Lady. Elara sat on the bench behind the center and opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of folded construction paper. In childish handwriting, large and sincere, it read, "Dear Angel Lady, I miss you. Daddy does too. He does not laugh without you. Love, Sophie." Elara pressed the note to her chest, her eyes wet before she could blink them clear. She had tried to convince herself she had done the right thing, by leaving, by not replacing someone else. But Sophie's words cracked something wide open. Maybe it was not about replacing. Maybe it was about belonging. 2 days later, as late afternoon light poured golden over the fields, a sleek black car pulled into the gravel drive. Grant stepped out. He wore a simple gray sweater and jeans, not the CEO uniform, not the guarded man from Manhattan, just a father, just a man searching for someone he let go too easily. He spotted her through the garden arch, her hair pulled into a loose braid, a smudge of paint on her cheek from helping the children make paper suns. He approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. She turned at the sound of footsteps and froze. Neither spoke. Then Grant held out a rolled-up drawing. Elara took it. It was Sophie's artwork, done in thick markers and glitter stickers. 3 figures stood under a rainbow. A man, a little girl in a pink dress, and in the middle a tall woman with yellow curls and a bright sun above her head. At the top, the title read in pink marker, "Our Real Family." Elara covered her mouth. Grant gently set something down at her feet. It was the stuffed bear. The one Elara had given Sophie months ago, when she was scared to sleep alone. Its little ribbon had been replaced with a tag that now read, "Come home." Grant slowly knelt on one knee, not in proposal, but in something deeper, in honesty, in surrender. "I did not come to replace what I lost," he said quietly. "I came because I do not want someone like my wife. I want you." Elara's eyes filled, her hands trembling around the drawing. Grant added, softer now. And Sophie, she wants you too. She chose you. Way before I ever did. Alara knelt too, her forehead resting gently against his. I left because I thought I was protecting your memories, she whispered. But maybe we're allowed to build new ones. He nodded once. And there, in the quiet field with the sound of distant children's laughter, no promises were spoken. But something better bloomed, a choice to love again. Snowflakes floated gently in the night air, catching the golden lights strung above the courtyard like little stars. It was the annual Thorn Foundation Winter Gala, this time not in a grand ballroom, but in a community space warmed by laughter, hot cocoa, and lanterns swaying in the wind. Children ran past in coats and scarves, volunteers handed out hand-knit gloves, and a string quartet played a soft, familiar melody. At the center of it all stood Alara. She wore a soft ivory coat over a cranberry-red dress, her blonde curls tucked beneath a velvet beret. She moved between tables, greeting guests, checking the donation counters, adjusting lanterns, her hands calm, her smile steady. She belonged here, because this time she was not just attending. She was the coordinator, and she was not alone. From across the crowd, Grant watched her. He had not said much all evening, but his gaze never left her. Beside him, Sophie clutched a small bouquet of dried lavender, her pink winter dress bouncing with every excited step. As the event neared its end, the MC announced, "Before we close tonight, Mr. Thorne has one final surprise." Alara turned toward the stage, confused. Then, she saw Sophie walking toward her, carefully, proudly, the lavender bouquet held tight. The little girl stopped in front of her and looked up with shining eyes. "Daddy has something to ask you," she said. Alara knelt down slowly, her hands shaking slightly as she took the bouquet. The lavender smelled of comfort and beginnings. Then Grant stepped forward. He was in a charcoal coat, snowflakes speckling his shoulders. No microphone, no speech cards, just him, and a small velvet box in his hand. He lowered to one knee. Gasps and camera flashes flickered through the crowd, but Alara only saw him. Grant opened the box. Inside was a simple, elegant ring, white gold, with a single lavender sapphire. He looked up at her and said, voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, "Will you be my daughter's angel again? And my wife?" Alara's breath caught. Tears spilled quietly down her cheeks. Her heart, bruised, healed, brave, felt full in a way it never had before. She dropped to her knees and nodded, laughing through her tears. "Yes, yes, I will." The crowd erupted into cheers, but all Alara could hear was Sophie's squeal of joy as she threw her arms around both of them. Snow continued to fall as the three embraced, not as a beginning, not as an ending, but as a home. Later, as the lights dimmed and families headed home, Alara stood beneath the same canopy of lanterns, her hand laced with Grant's, Sophie dancing around them. She whispered against the wind, "I came for a charity dinner, but I found my forever family." And in the hush of snowfall and soft music, a truth echoed. Love does not always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes, it walks in quietly, sits beside you at dinner, and never leaves. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of the quiet power of love, or simply made you believe in second chances again, don't forget to support us. Subscribe to Kindness and Love Tales for more heartfelt stories that celebrate empathy, family, and the unexpected ways love finds us. Click that subscribe button and tap hype so you never miss a moment that might just change how you see the world. Because sometimes, the gentlest stories leave the deepest marks. Thanks for watching. And remember, love begins where kindness lives.